You are listening to the podcast series of the Forum on Central and Eastern Europe of KU Leuven. In our 20-minute conversations, we discuss the latest academic research on the region. I am Martin Kohlrausch and I am a professor of European political history here at KU Leuven. With me today is Stefan Auer, who is a professor of European Studies in the School of Modern Languages and Cultures at the University of Hong Kong. We'd like to use this concise format to jointly look into a theme which, as few others, combines problems of today's European or EU's politics and Europe's historical legacy, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the European response, or as some might say, the lack thereof. At different moments after Russia's occupation of Crimea and after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Stefan Auer proposed a new reading of Carl Schmitt's conception of geopolitics, or Großraum in Schmitt's terms, to better understand what the EU should and particularly could do to support Ukraine. Now, while Schmitt, referred to as a dangerous mind, might be an appropriate reference in the dangerous times we live in, I'm sure that many would also object to invoking Schmitt, who's after all quite popular in today's Russia, or at least some circles in Russia, and has a quite tainted past in Nazi Germany, to invoke him in a debate on a better functioning EU. In a nutshell, Stefan, why do you believe that Schmitt still has something to say to us today? Why does he help us to better understand the EU today?
Thanks for the kind introduction and thanks for the question. There is no doubt in my mind that Carl Schmitt was a deplorable human being. I want to state it from the outset. I have no admiration for Carl Schmitt. As an individual, he showed appalling lack of political judgment by endorsing Nazism. He is rightly called the crown jurist of Nazi Germany. But he was also a brilliant political and legal philosopher. He was a very incisive critique of liberalism, and he was the preeminent thinker of geopolitics. And he thought about the challenges of the kind that we face today, the politics of the exception. He thought about the nature of the political. And I think those insights and those ideas have a lot to tell us about contemporary challenges that the EU also faces. So, yes, as you mentioned, he's hugely popular in Putin's Russia, even in contemporary China. But I think we would miss out if we completely ignored his ideas, because there is something there to learn also for us liberals, for people committed to Western-style liberal democracy.
Of course, also is interesting for Schmitt, regarding Schmitt, for us as looking at these developments from different angles, from a historical angle, from a more political science, philosophical angle, European studies angle, is that he was situated in a period which in many ways is reminiscent of our own, so the 1930s. In the 1930s, we had a revisionist power, Nazi Germany, which challenged the existing order, but at the same time wanted to establish a new order. It's a very dynamic period, but also, and Schmitt described this or justified the changes, these changes, but at the same time, Nazi Germany and Schmitt aspired for a new order, something static. Now, if you invoke Schmitt in your articles in order to describe today's role of the EU, how would you see Schmitt's thinking? Is it something which helps us to explain where the EU should develop, in which direction it should develop or will develop, or is it rather interesting in order to describe how the EU does look like today?
This is the thing that he wrote many of his crucial works basically 100 years ago, and for some time now, definitely since 1989, we felt that those times are safely behind us, right? So the EU was explicitly the project that no longer needs to kind of engage with these old-fashioned concepts like national sovereignty. We no longer need to think about violent conflicts. We celebrated EU as a soft power Europe, right? That we can change the world through conversation, through negotiations, etc., right? But the reality of this revisionist power that we have in the East, Russia, and even more assertive China, presents challenges that the EU is not prepared for, right? The world in which EU could and did thrive no longer exists, particularly, I believe, since the full-blown invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. But I argued already after the invasion of Crimea that the EU needs to wake up to a new geopolitical reality in which kind of technocratic approach to political problems no longer suffices. And that is one of the key insights that I think Schmitt gives us, that the nature of the political is to deal with violent conflicts, irreconcilable conflicts. If you have no conflicts, you don't need politics, as it were, right? Many people think that, administering a city or whatnot, a peaceful city is politics, but it's mostly managing stuff, right? Which is what the EU was good at. But dealing with violent conflicts or dealing with conflicts is something that is profoundly political, and oftentimes there are no straightforward technocratic solutions. So the EU approached Russia, approached Ukraine as a technocratic problem, and that approach failed.
Isn't it not also a problem of EU's politics that it is very much schematic in many ways, and we have now a much more dynamic situation? You refer to Russia as a revisionist power, as a power which puts into question the new order of after 1989, 91, but that the EU has also problems of dealing with a country like Ukraine, which doesn't fit into the categories which we knew. It was mostly about, if we think about former accessions, that was about certain problems of the rule of law, certain problems in economic terms lagging behind, and so forth. And now we have a situation which is very different in many ways, and in which is also hard to make space for Ukrainian agency to understand Ukraine as an independent power with a very specific trajectory, very different specific aspirations. How would you look at this problem?
Yes, so the EU stumbled into that conflict, and it stumbled into it already with that EU neighborhood policy that actually led to the Maidan movement, right? And the EU was unable to respond then to that more assertive Russia. But it is a systemic problem that the EU has, because many of my colleagues dealing with EU as a polity celebrated for decades, that it is an in-between polity, that it is an experimental polity. That now became a liability, right? Because I think in times of conflict, in times of war, you need a much more cohesive political community, which is something that is at the heart of Schmitt's conception of political. So he argues, and I will cite from Schmitt, that the political implies the existence of a politically united people who is willing to fight for its existence, independence, and freedom. Now, this idea is scary and discredited, right? Because this is what the Nazis bought into. But when you look at the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, was it not for that united will of the Ukrainian people to defend their homeland? We would no longer have Ukraine, right? And my question is whether the EU can replicate anything like that. I mean, there is an interesting phenomenon when you see leading EU politicians, Ursula von der Leyen, Charles Michel, so the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, celebrating Ukrainians, and she argues that they are dying for Europe. I don't think they are dying for Europe, frankly. They are dying Ukraine, and they see the future of Ukraine in wider Europe. But the EU cannot replicate that kind of sentiment because the EU is not a state, right? So my worry is that what the EU has done is it disempowered to some extent the constituting member states that grew accustomed to living in a peaceful, post-national, even post-liberal world, right? It disempowered the member states, but it didn't create the kind of power at the European level, notwithstanding all these discussions about the need for a European sovereignty. I cannot imagine, for example, that the EU could have its own army. I don't think it's desirable, and I don't think it's feasible, right? And of course, many people would say, well, it's for NATO to do that. But then the EU should abandon this assertive posture, right, and create kind of promise things to Ukraine that it cannot act upon, which has happened actually early on in this conflict. And I have to say, I moved actually with my argumentation a bit, because I had an article discussing Carl Schmitt in the Kremlin in 2015, published in 2015, that was in the immediate aftermath of the takeover of Crimea, and I urged the EU to take that challenge seriously, and I urged the EU to be a more assertive kind of sovereign actor, and that hasn't happened, and I now realize that it could not have happened, and now I would argue more in favor of empowering the member states of the European Union, empowering NATO as a military organization, and I think only through these means you can mobilize people's commitment to defend their own countries, but also then more effectively to assist Ukraine in its fight against Russia.
Thank you. I very much agree with this, to my mind, very, very pertinent reading of these developments of the last 10 years. Now, you mentioned the term sovereignty, which is, of course, a central term to Carl Schmitt and also in this whole debate we are in today. It's often said that these countries which support Ukraine much more staunchly than some Western countries, like the Baltic countries, like Poland, the Czech Republic, they do so because they're simply closer to what's happening. It's in their own interest. But with a view to sovereignty, isn't it also a very different historical experience with the Baltic countries, the experience of 89 in Poland? Probably people would quote 44, the Warsaw Uprising, and then again 89, which is much closer, or in their reading resembles what Ukraine, what happened in Ukraine in the Maidan Revolution and in the more recent events. How could we fit this into the EU, into EU politics? Is this something which would help the EU to move to more adequate politics, or is it rather something which divides the EU, which are so different historical experiences as compared to many of the Western members, which almost make it impossible to come to solutions which help the EU to deal with today's situation?
Well, that makes me think of a crucial essay that I'm sure you're familiar with, essay by Czech writer Milan Kundera, The Tragedy of Central Europe, that was just reissued actually very recently. And there he argued that the tragedy of Central Europe was that these were what he called small nations of Central Europe caught between Russia and the Soviet Union and Germany, right? And they had to fear for their very survival as nations, for their national sovereignty. And that's a counterintuitive argument, talking about small nations. Poland, for example, your expertise, right, is surely not a small nation by European standards.
Indeed.
And Ukraine, certainly not a small nation. And yet, the national anthem of both Poland and Ukraine starts by this famous line, Poland has not perished yet. So that sense of insecurity is there, but that also conversely results in a much stronger commitment to defending national sovereignty. And this is where I believe that Poland, the Czech Republic, and Ukraine in the future too are at odds with the dominant view of the vision for a European Union as a post-sovereign entity in which nations no longer are meant to be all that important. And I think that challenge is kind of still underestimated. I mean, at this stage, we don't even know how practically Ukraine could become a full member of the European Union in a short-term future. But when it comes to it, then their conceptions of the future EU would be much more similar to those that are prevalent in Poland or the Czech Republic, and they prefer a Europe of nation states. I found it quite amusing when the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz presented a speech on the future of Europe, in which he also cited Milan Kundera to make an argument in favor of more united Europe, a more federalized Europe in which nation states would actually no longer have the ultimate control over their destiny in member states, because he was arguing in favor of abolishing the unanimity requirement in the foreign affairs and security policies, which I think is there for a good reason, and if anything, I would advocate that element should be strengthened, because the power ultimately resides with nation states. People in Europe, and I respect that, are not even willing to die for their own country. No one is going to die for the EU. This is where I said Ursula von der Leyen misrepresents also the nature of the fight for a free Ukraine. And once that is accepted, then we can't have EU military. And once that is accepted, then surely there needs to be a kind of acceptance of the fact that nation states still matter in this volatile world that we now live in. And I think that is where a bit more realism on the part of EU leaders would be beneficial, both for Europeans and for Ukraine.
Yeah, this perhaps leads us to the last aspect point we should address. In your article, you also talk about Schmitt, perhaps counterintuitively, as someone who helps us to not overburden political expectations with regard to the EU. So your argument, if I got it right, is the EU is on the one hand promising far too much, aspiring far too much, and then doing far too little. And Schmitt, in certain parts of his writing, is also talking, when he's talking about how to contain war, he's talking about exactly this, that there are too many expectations coming with how to regulate war, how to build international law. Perhaps again, in a nutshell, how would you connect these two dots, the thinking of Schmitt in the late 1920s, 1930s about how to contain war, the aspirations, the expectations coming with it, and to a more realistic approach, and today's EU and its role in the conflict, in this conflict particularly, but perhaps also more broadly speaking?
There are perhaps two aspects of that question, if I may. So the first one is, I really found it disturbing how bold the initial statements were from leading EU officials. Borrell promised fighter jets like days after the full-blown invasion of Ukraine. And of course, it didn't happen because he had no capacity to do that. Then, more practically, the EU promised Ukraine that it would deliver like 1 million pieces of ammunition within a year. And again, they managed to deliver like 500,000. Now, as a scholar, as a student of European integration, I know that this is a well-established method, basically, of EU governance that many of my colleagues celebrate, because, you give yourself an aim and you might not achieve that aim fully, but it's good enough. Yeah. This is not good enough in times of war. Like, how can you plan as a general in Ukraine with this kind of commitment that will then not eventuate? So that has very real consequences. People might die as a result of that kind of misjudgment. And that is where the EU is kind of pushed towards becoming a more Schmittian political entity, which it cannot be, right? And yet being stuck because of its very strong normative commitments, which I consider important, right? In this kind of shape that makes it look more like a technocratic entity. So the other aspect of Schmitt containing the war, I mean, that's a bit more ambivalent and difficult to really invoke Schmitt for that, because obviously as a political actor he endorsed Nazi expansionist plans. That is the very meaning of Grossraum for him. So I want to part company from that. But a recent book by a prominent American legal philosopher, Paul Kahn, argues basically in favor of political theology. He's reviving the Schmittian concept of political theology, and he points out that the Western countries, the free West, has at its heart an acceptance of the exception, precisely in relation to the possibility of war. So the very fact that you have leading Western nations, not Germany, for very good historical reasons, but the United States, an actor we didn't discuss here, but crucially important for the future of Ukraine and for the future of Europe, and France, these two countries are nuclear powers, and the United Kingdom, they are nuclear powers. Now, the ways in which the authority over these nuclear weapons are organized in those three countries might differ, but at the heart of it, you empower a sovereign leader of that sovereign nation to do something that would cause unimaginable suffering on an unimaginable scale. So the argument there is that whatever rule of law state you have, right, and all the rules and commitments you have, and all the commitments to the international law, go out of the window. That the very existence of those weapons points towards the kind of ultimate commitment to our way of life. We would be defending it. Oppenheimer, as a movie, thematized it very powerfully, right? That we would defend our way of life, even if the risks are, well, basically the annihilation of mankind. It's scary even to contemplate, right? But the reality is that these leading Western nations, and we thank the United States for protecting Europe, right, against the Soviet Union, even now against Putin's Russia. So at the heart of it is actually that supremely political problem that points us towards the nature of the political, Schmitt conceptualizes, where technocratic solutions, where commitment to law, to rules, no longer suffice. And my point there is that the EU can never have democratic structures that could live up to that task, right? The EU is far too diverse, far too eclectic in its composition to create democratic structures that would be both effective enough to empower a sovereign leader to do something like that, and yet democratic enough to maintain enough legitimacy. We can see now that even in the United States that is a very formidable problem, and it is a functioning polity that has proved its viability over more than 2 centuries, right? We see problems in France, in the United Kingdom, but these are all powerful and successful nation states, historically speaking. The EU cannot replicate that model, and I think it's a dangerous fantasy that it could do so. And that is one of the many lessons I would draw from Schmitt.
Thank you very much, Stefan, Professor Auer, for sharing your insights with us on Carl Schmitt, on the EU, on the war in Ukraine, which put many of the problems we're dealing with in very sharp relief here.
Thanks for your invitation.